Hi. I'm Mary Flanagan, and I have a work upstairs in this building called Help Me Know the Truth. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation behind the work, and then I'd like to discuss how the work is working and some of the implications about it, and save some time for discussion, because I think there's a lot of interesting crossovers between all of us artists up here and the concerns. So the work is primarily one about understanding other people and judging other people through faces and through images of faces. And so I'm inspired by a lot of contemporary rhetoric about facial recognition and the way we're building and participating in systems that ultimately categorize us. So you know, Facebook has demonstrated its new facial imaging technology, which is 97.25% accurate, which is within a percentage point of human accuracy. And they call this the deep face technology, which is really interesting when we think everything is deep now, by the way. We have deep fakes, deep face, and you know, there's some other implications to that when you think about the history of pornography. Anyway, so very strange. It's very strange. But what's really interesting is not necessarily like the accuracy. Can we make our facial recognition systems more accurate? That's not really what's inherently unnerving me. It's that new technologies are moving faster than we can track with legislation or with any kind of management or even public conversation. And technologies are being used, of course, to quantify and record the self, and we don't even actually need any evidence of that self anymore. We have everything in terms of data. Almost all of these facial recognition systems, Amazon, by the way, has a facial recognition system. Google, Snapchat, for example, right here, you don't really need to save the photograph and when you have all the data points from the face in the photograph and you've already constructed a 3D image of the face. So who owns that? Where is our digital artifact of our three-dimensional representation of ourselves wandering around in the dataverse somewhere linked to our employment, our shopping habits, and everything else? We actually almost have a virtual, they actually own a virtual version of ourselves. So this isn't just a question of this idea of accuracy, although that's what tends to make the news. I really like that in the United States, members of Congress are matched with criminals. That's very timely. But it's how the data can be used that's really the challenge. And so, I'm bringing this photo up of Ruth Porat, who's Google's parent company Alphabet's chief financial officer. And almost every day in the news, if you look at the news, which is really hard these days, you can find evidence of humans and their silly, silly biases. And then, of course, their dangerous biases, right? So there was an incident where she was talked about in a financial meeting with Google representatives as the lady CFO. Like, why don't we just ask the lady CFO? Like, there's another CFO for the company. There was only one CFO, but for some reason, everyone started referring to her as the lady CFO. And she's like, nuh-uh, we don't need to address my gender when referring to my job title. And these kinds of unintentional biases, whether they be in hiring practices, whether they be in how we walk down the street, when we feel safe, these are leading to large-scale social concerns that we have all around the world. Most recently, you know, you can think of the Chemnitz protests as an embodiment of like fear of the other. We're always, as humans, making mistakes and othering people at the same time. This is proven time and time again. And it's really interesting when you try to decide, okay, well, how can we measure that? How do you determine how far off we are? And since 1998, there have been some really interesting research tools. I don't know if people are familiar in the room of the IAT test, or the Implicit Association test developed at Harvard by Mazaren Banaji and Anthony Greenwald. And what they tried to do is put categories together that might be unlikely and see how long it would take somebody to actually make a match. So for example, if I give you the prompt of salary, we're probably talking about jobs, right? So you might say career. But when we see the word female, it fights against that idea of career, and you want to go to male, right? So that would be the stereotypical response. So if it takes you longer to answer, and then you select female, or if you just select male out of instinct, then you would be, we can actually measure how much you're having to take an unconscious process and move it to consciousness and make a conscious decision. So this is really the kind of science, some of the science behind biases, the way we can reveal some of these biases. And there have been really interesting repetitions of this study about race, about gender, about jobs, this kind of thing. But this is like one test out of many, many, many other tests. Here's another kind of version of it, bad, good, and because we're measuring people's instinctive reaction time. So I got I run a research lab where I measure people's psychological responses to different game interventions for pro-social causes, and I was looking for some new research tools, and I kept thinking, well, this IAT test is really interesting, but what else is out there? And I stumbled across a different test. Because as an artist, I'm primarily an artist, and I wanted to use the tools of science to actually reflect upon what they're revealing and what they're revealing about how we see each other. So I took this on both as a kind of research project in my lab, but then also as an artist thinking about, well, how do we know certain things? Like if we're walking down the street and it's like, oh, that person's a criminal. How do we know? Or how do people know when looking in the airport security cameras, oh, that's the person we should track, or that's the these kinds of things are so subjective and so so unscientific at some points because they're relying on our biases. How can we get to the bottom of these inner workings? So I wanted to keep this exploration alive, and I found a different test. And that test is called reverse correlation. And it's used by cognitive neuroscientists to actually not just see a difference in a bias. So for example, if I see two pictures, I'm more biased, but to actually construct what's in your unconscious, to construct the bias in your head. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that from nothing? How do we construct a face? Well, we can do that, actually. So in the actual neuroscience test, the scientists use vetted photographs of a person's face. There are these databases of neutral photos, which is also, kind of funny from an artist's perspective that there's such a thing as neutral photos. But anyway, so they can take neutral photos and apply noise patterns onto the photos. And the noise patterns shift the shadows and the features a little bit, right? And so through adding the noise pattern and seeing if someone selects a particular noise pattern over another, we can actually see noise upon noise upon noise shaping the shape and look of the face. So it's a cumulative type of test. Now, these are the kinds of noise patterns that are added. So to generate the test stimuli in my installation upstairs, you actually get involved as audience members. We use your selfie instead of some vetted psychological image, and we take that selfie, add these noise patterns, and then present it on stations to be judged. So here's what it looks like upstairs. So people come to the exhibit. You take a selfie at this selfie station, and you move through, and these are called choosing stations. And on each one of these stations, it's the same photograph with two slightly altered images with different noise patterns, and then I assign a random prompt. So it takes it depends on how many people are taking selfies, but it can take 4 minutes, probably under 10 minutes to get from the selfie station into the choosing station. So it's a live process that's happening upstairs as I run the image through the noise patterns, okay? So by selecting these variations or versions of someone over time, we get a different face. We get different shadows on the face. We have slight changes. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is that the changes aren't that obnoxious. It's not like I turn into a cartoon character. It's not like I turn into something very different than myself. The real creepy thing is actually it's just a slight version. It could be just a shadow on your face. It could be just a little bit different. So here are some images. After an image is passed through those choosing stations 6 times, it's labeled permanently in in a projected display. So here are some from yesterday, the people coming to the exhibit. And, you know, again, it looks enough like the person to probably recognize them if you know them, but the likelihood is perhaps not. So I'm really interested in how we bring this notion of truth to our technologies, that we can somehow, you know, that we're carrying around an idealized image or a negative image. When someone says select a victim, select an angel, or select a terrorist, how am I judging what those two things look like? How am I creating the stereotype in my head? So I have to tell a little bit of a story. I'm going to skip ahead of my slideshow here. I have to tell a little bit of a story about the making of this because I have time. And think about a quote, by the way, from Thich Nhat Hanh, who talks about, we must learn to see that the person in front of us is ourself and that we are that person. This goes back to the robotic notion of consciousness. Like, you know, what creates a person is perhaps not the boundaries between us, but the connection between us. So perhaps that's an interesting way to think about this kind of stuff. But I'm really interested in these binary questions that we're asking and why we can put them into our technology. But first I want to look into building the system. I'm just going to skip ahead to this really problematic thing that happened in the construction of this, which showed me that this is a continuing, this is not old news. So, you know, there are many coding options out there for creating this. So I use this Swift 3 as the programming language for iOS. It's running on iPads, and the iOS core image package. So core image is this image processing and analysis tech that does low-level graphics processing. It's got an API where you can easily make a camera. And it has this thing, CI detector to find faces in images. So it's already built in to the code for your iOS to be able to find faces in images. Well, that's nice and kind of interesting that it's, you know, is that really well known that every app could actually do this? Like, that's kind of good to know. So anyway, so we're sitting around making this picture. It can also tell some simple gesture and facial recognition. It can see if you're smiling or not, for example. So before shipping the material in this first exhibition, I did some tests. I actually I teach at a university, and I was installing it in my research lab and had all of the students coming in. And really interesting, a student came up in front of the work and tried to take a selfie, and it gave this warning, no face was detected. Okay. So we tried other people. I said, oh no, I have a bug, of course, right? Everything has a bug. And for some reason, it never recognized her face, but it recognized everyone else's face. And I thought, okay, well, why is this? Why is this? And then we realized that she wore a headscarf. Now, this is the code that is built into Apple products, right? That she's wearing this headscarf. And then we started doing things, you know, male beards worked fine, you know, and then so anyway, we ended up getting around it, but our technologies themselves have these very inherent biases, and that we somehow think that they're these neutral, safe things is very strange. There are some recent psychological studies which show that people trust answers from a machine more than they trust answers from a person. Now, for me, that's part of what this work is about, that we're actually being asked to be that machine, because in fact the people making rules are people just like us with just our everyday problems. So help me know the truth. It's upstairs. I'd like you to try it out, and you know, this is part of a larger set of works that I'm thinking about. There's this really ridiculous program called the TSA, that's the US if you've gone to the US, you've probably run into the TSA. They're the people who control our airport security. They have another program called the SPOT program, where there's a list of 90-some behaviors that that are completely unscientifically proven about how you can go through an airport and be more suspicious, including tapping your feet, whistling. You know, these mark against you on their list of things that are up there.
So of course, you know, it's cost $1 billion since its inception, and it's completely based on no science. So I think it's time that we really think about how messy our humanness is and celebrate that, and think about the way that we can work in some kind of resistance, but acknowledging that we're all still in this resistance. And I keep fighting with this quote from Foucault about we're never in this position of exteriority. We're all, you know, I'm giving a talk to you on an Apple product while I'm critiquing Apple software. So that, like, these contradictions are the feature of our age, and also a feature of a struggle for power. But this question has not gone away, and I'm going to leave you with this case. You probably heard about this case, I think it was this year, about a woman in China known as Yan, who used her iPhone 10 was unlocked by her friend. And these are the two women. And she called Apple, no one would believe her, so she took it to the iPhone store, and they gave her a new iPhone, and the second iPhone did the same thing. And you know, it's just a clear case of, again, this is a tip of the iceberg. It's this inaccuracy about representing things. I'm not asking things to be more perfect in their representation, that we can be more exact, which is the tech way of trying to solve the problem. I think the humanist way to solve this problem is to say, why do we really want to rely and give up all of this data and rely on all the data to make the decisions for us? So thank you.